As before, we're looking forward to a great discussion following our usual format, and it has fallen to me happily to introduce our speakers, who I am particularly excited about. First, we will hear from Bethany Nowviskie. Dean of Libraries, Professor of English at James Madison University. Bethany is also the Chief Academic Technology Officer there. She previously directed the Digital Library Federation at CLIR and was the founding director of the Scholars Lab at UVA, where she was a research associate professor of digital humanities. She's also been the past president of the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations. Is that it? Is that the A in ADHO? I never remember.
No, of ACH, of the Association for Computers and the Humanities, which is part of ADHO.
Right, part of ADHO. Thank you. But for me, Bethany's work, I think, can be summed up in one word, and that is praxis. That's not only the title of her entry in 2020's Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities. I think it's a concept that sums up the importance of Bethany's work to both the library and digital humanities communities. Although I've encountered her work at the beginning of my own digital humanities journey, my most startling introduction, I think, was during her renowned plenary for the 2014 ADHO conference in Lausanne. Her talk called Digital Humanities in the Anthropocene, in which she issued a call to recognize the work that digital humanities can do in the face of climate disaster, social injustice, and the loss of cultural artifacts that have all become too common in the 21st century. Her talk wasn't about what DH could study, visualize, or compute, but what it could do. And this is the ethos that I feel infuses her work. Whether her task is building, preserving, archiving, or creating community, her work remains attentive to the action at the heart of what we do. In Bethany's hands, the archive, our subject tonight, is not a static repository lying in a library, but an active, vital process that requires attention, intention, and action. From our articles in the field, the library, GIS, pedagogy, or digital literacy, all of which she's published extensively on, to her tireless efforts at advocacy for marginalized communities, Bethany has not only been at the heart of digital humanities, but I think is the heart of the best that DH can do. Following Bethany, I'm thrilled that we will hear next from Alisea McLeod. Alisea is the program manager for curriculum innovation at the University of Chicago's Institute on the Formation of Knowledge, a former chair of humanities at Rust College. She has held previous academic appointments at St. Augustine's College of Raleigh, Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, and Indiana University. She's recently, 2018 or 19, won the NEH Advanced Grant. 19. So even more recently, for her project that we're particularly it caused us to want her to come, Freedom's Movement, African-American Space in War and Reconstruction. And she's also held a humanities grant for public good, funded by the Council of Independent Colleges and Mellon. What struck me so forcibly about Professor McLeod's work is the way that it reveals the importance of stories to history. Her transition from a professor of rhetoric to what I'm going to very presumptively call a digital historian it seems less of a transformation, I feel like, than an extension. The brilliant, crucial, public-facing project, Last Road to Freedom, has surfaced countless records of African-American experience living behind Union lines during the Civil War, and has allowed not only scholars, but members of the Black community to tell stories of their families and recover histories that were, in many cases, deliberately erased. Professor McLeod's work teaches us that an archive is not merely a scholarly resource, nor a unified record of history, but that it can be a force for public good, freeing crucial cultural information and giving voice to communities of experience who were robbed of this critical freedom. Now, Alisea is going to be joined by our third speaker, Cynthia McLeod. Cynthia is a PhD student in the Department of Communications at UCSB, where she arrived after completing her BSc in psychology with a minor in African American studies at Howard, followed by an MSc in, and I didn't know this was a thing, and I'm so excited, digital anthropology at UCL, where her thesis was entitled Black Twitter, Temporality, Respatializations, and placemaking. Reading her work, I feel like it moves in an interestingly opposite direction to Alicea's, by which I mean, whereas with Professor McLeod's efforts involving taking physical documents and creating online resources, Cynthia's work begins in the online environment, exploring how online communities can create virtual resources for members of under-resourced communities. Her articles and work focus not just on describing current social media trends, but on the active creations of resources for community building, showing us what it can look like when a platform is designed within, for example, the needs of a Black or Latino, Latinx community in mind. Finally, as per our usual plan, we will have a response from Peter Leonard. Peter is, of course, the Assistant University Librarian for Research and Data Services. He holds a PhD in Scandinavian Literature from WashU and was formerly the Director of Digital Humanities Lab at Yale University Library, where he also taught in the departments of Statistics and Data Science. What's always impressed me about Peter's work is his dedication to making resources discoverable. Like our presenters, he's deeply invested in freeing the digital archives from their closed, lockdown, or contract-bound homes in libraries and making them operable resources for scholars both within the university and without. Perhaps his most notable project before coming to Stanford, at least the one I first heard of him in association with, at the Yale Digital Humanities Center, involved a novel approach to the Vogue magazine archive, using the computational tools, for example, topic models, image recognition, to make the vast catalog of the magazine navigable and searchable. Peter's work reminds us of the important role that libraries play, not just in creating or indexing digitized archives, but in making them open and available to those that need them, using, in the parlance of our seminar, computation and counting to redress the problems with access these resources have always been subject to. So please join me in welcoming our three speakers and respondents. And at that, I will, after, turn it over to Bethany.
Well, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction and how wonderful it is to be in such distinguished company for the talk tonight. I am so sorry that I wound up not being able to be with you in person today. I may be feeling done with the pandemic, but it is clearly not yet done with me. And I'd like to share my sincere thanks to Mark, Nicole, and Giovanna, and the rest of the organizing team for making it possible for me to join you remotely. I'm going to start screen sharing, and if you can also just give me a thumbs up if you're able to see everything properly. Are you seeing my screen? Okay, I think I see thumbs up. You're very, very little for me now. I am presenting on behalf of many colleagues at James Madison University who are all engaged from the various organizational and professional and personal perspectives that they bring to bear on something we call flowerings, and hence my title tonight, Reparative Archives and the JMU Flowerings Project. But conscious of your Sawyer Seminar focus on the data that divide us, I have a subtitle too. And that is Tending the Data That Mend Us. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why in a minute. But first, what is Flowerings? It's a collaboration between the JMU libraries on the one hand, which is the combined university library and educational technology organization that I have the privilege to lead, serving a campus of some 26,000 people here in beautiful Central Virginia, and an amazing women of color-led center based here at JMU, which is rapidly coming up on its 30th anniversary, and that is the Furious Flower Poetry Center. Now, Furious Flower is the nation's oldest academic center for the study and appreciation of Black poetry. It was founded by the amazing Dr. Joanne Gavin with a field-defining conference hosted here at JMU in 1994, also perhaps the first major academic conference to focus exclusively on Black poetry and the spoken word. And Joanne, who is a towering figure in the field, was my first partner in crime on this project. She's now an emeritus faculty member at JMU. And if I had had a little more warning that this was going to be a Zoom, we might have been able to arrange for her to be on the call alongside my current close collaborator and co-PI, whom you see on the screen the brilliant Trinidadian American poet Lauren Aline, who took over from her as Furious Flowers executive director last year. So Joanne on the left and Lauren on the right. The origin story for Furious Flower and our project is this, and I think I'll stop screen sharing for just a minute. Am I back? You can see me again? Okay, because I'm just going to talk for a while. So Joanne had the tremendous foresight in 1994 to insist that the entire conference that sparked the idea for the center be videotaped. And that conference included scholarly conversations and numerous performances by poets. And some of them were well established, but others were very early career and only later on became major figures. And I'll just give you a few selected names that I pulled out of the program from that 1994 event. Elizabeth Alexander, Amiri Baraka, Rita Dove, Nikki Giovanni was there, Hakeem Matabuti was there, Eugene Redmond, Sonia Sanchez was there, Sharon Strange was there, Natasha Trethaway was there, Kevin Young was there, and Gwendolyn Brooks was there, whose poem, Second Sermon on the Warpland, later gave its name to the poetry center that emerged from the conference. The time Brooks wrote cracks into Furious Flower. It lifts its face all unashamed and sways in wicked grace. So audience members were captured on video from the conference too. It wasn't just people who were up at the podium. And that included a young student named Ta-Nehisi Coates, who drove down from Howard University to listen in. And he wound up asking questions from the audience, and he participated in an open mic. The conference was such a success that Joanne went on to host another one 10 years later, and another one 10 years after that. And we will host the 4th decade-defining Furious Flower Conference at JMU this September. And she made sure that every significant poet and performer visiting the center in between the conferences was recorded as well across all the media types that have evolved in the period between 1994 and the present day. Some of those tapes from the conferences especially were edited into public television programs. Most sat on shelves or on hard drives under people's desks, and they eventually made their way alongside the paper records of the center and of Joanne's long and illustrious career to the JMU libraries. And our special collections team there were well equipped to process and preserve those paper records. And they had done that admirably when I arrived at JMU in 2019. And I had the great pleasure of meeting Joanne, and we hit it off immediately. I'll say more about that in a minute too. But I quickly learned more about the state of our digital collections infrastructure and that treasure trove of undescribed, unprocessed, and largely unremediated audiovisual records of what was then a quarter century of Black poetry and spoken word. And I mean, well, basically, first I needed to breathe into a paper bag for a while. And my next step was to set up a call with the Mellon Foundation, because I wanted us not only to be an organization capable of stewarding this precious content properly, but one that deserved the honor. So as important as it was to get those AV collections stabilized, made accessible, preserved, far more important to us was that we were doing that work thoughtfully in a framework based on deep equity and understanding and growth, and with full consciousness of what it meant to do this work in a predominantly white library led by one of the white women who make up 85, whatever it is, +% of the library profession, situated in a predominantly white university that had frankly not always been so welcoming or done so well by Joanne and Furious Flower. Lael Hughes Watkins' concept of reparative archives was inspiring to us because there were some things here in need of redress and repair. Reparative archives are those that, in the SAA's terms, and I'll quote, intentionally focus on historically underrepresented groups. They remedy past archival practices that have excluded, silenced, harmed, or mischaracterized marginalized people. And Lael, who later advised on our project, writes that, I'm going to read again. Reparative archival work does not pretend to ignore the imperialist, racist, homophobic, sexist, ableist, and other discriminatory practices of mainstream archives, but instead acknowledges these failures and engages in conscious actions toward a wholeness that may seem to be an exercise in futility, she writes, but is actually an ethical imperative for all within traditional archival spaces. Our initial planning grant from Mellon was not what has been, in my experience, a more typical digital collections or scholarly communications infrastructure grant. We set it up to help good intentions take deeper roots and to really support the flourishing and flowering together of both of our organizations, the one under longtime leadership and the other with me in the mix as somebody new. And the grant was subtitled A Library in Transformation. And for our part, for the library's part, it was geared toward helping us develop a partnership model for digital library support of Furious Flower, not just as an historical archive, but as a living center for Black poetry and arts. And by extension, to help us make all the library's relationships, especially those requiring more authentic understandings and deeper cultural competencies, to make those more coherent, more inspiring, more impactful, more authentic and good. We did not, at the point of that planning grant, anticipate the pandemic, which broke out just a couple of months after we got it. And we extended that grant. It was, I think it was a $150,000 planning grant. We extended it to 2 years. We wound up conducting more of it online, of course, than we imagined. But even through all that, we and our teams and all the staff and faculty from all over the university who participated were able to explore complex and difficult issues and set ourselves up better ethically, interpersonally, organizationally for the work that was to come. And what ultimately has come for the Flowerings Project is kind of, I think you can think of it as twofold. First, we were able to secure a $2 million follow-up Mellon grant that will stretch into 2026, and it takes up an ambitious set of preservation, access, and publishing goals. For instance, it's helping us integrate archive space, Preservica, and aviary, to implement some new practices in archival description, and to stabilize some existing Furious Flower websites, including past digital archives prototypes and their wonderful online magazine, which is called The Fight and the Fiddle. It's also supporting ongoing Furious Flower programming and key aspects of the 2024 conference. It's helped us double the size of Furious Flower's staff and bring in a new digital archivist, digital preservationist, and our first tenure track curator for Black arts and culture onto the libraries team. I said we had a twofold outcome from our planning grant, and honestly, the impacts have been so multifarious and positive for us all. But the other major thing that evolved was this close and lovely relationship with Furious Flower. Made it a no-brainer for us to offer the center the opportunity to design a new physical space for itself when we sort of separately received the good news that we had been allocated funding from the Commonwealth of Virginia to renovate and expand our main campus library location, which is Carrier Library. So this is a 3-year, $130 million construction project. It's currently underway. And Furious Flower will move in with us in 2026 when we move back into Carrier in a location that's right next to our Digital and Distinctive Collections department on what I consider to be the best floor, new floor of the library. It's going to include conservation and book art spaces, our renovated makerspace, audiovisual studios, a new experimental technologies classroom, special collections, and will also include a reading room named for Gwendolyn Brooks. Furious Flower started its history at JMU, housed for far too long in a modular trailer. And it now resides in a little tract house with a basement that floods kind of across a sea of parking lots on the very fringe of campus. And so we are so excited to center in that new library design that we worked on together what has been too long on the margins. So I've just kind of told you the anticipated end of this chapter before I've really conveyed our findings from the planning grant, which is what I'd like to do in brief next. So I will start screen sharing again. Okay, again, think you can see that, but a thumbs up will help me know. Okay, I see thumbs up. Thank you. So yeah, what you're seeing now is a small pamphlet that we produced at the conclusion of the planning grant to try to capture some of our thought process and our learnings for whatever they might be worth for others. And there's more to that pamphlet than what I'll show you tonight. It's pretty easily findable on our website. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check it out. I'm going to highlight the pages that make up the 5 frames, or to keep our botanical metaphors that we so love at Furious Flower, the trellises of what we called the flowerings framework. Those are the things that we learned through the planning phase of the project and the concepts that are kind of propping us up and helping us blossom and grow. So first of all, from archives to futures, and I know there's a lot of text on the screen. I'm just going to give you the highlights of it. This is a frame about the Afrofuturist understanding of archival collections that informs our work. And that's something that I've written and spoken about in the past. And it really centers in the ways that we see the Furious Flower AV collection, not as inert historical records for passive playback, but as living instruments that can be improvised with and that can help new audiences and co-creators generate many possible better futures. So for each of these pages of the pamphlet, we've got, a little intro and some key questions. And the key questions that emerge around this frame touch on issues of centrality and perspective, basically. I've talked about marginalization tonight, but our advisory board members and partners from the Shift Collective helped us think in more sophisticated ways about what has always been central and to whom. And we have some questions in there too about time itself. The next one, authority and equity, it treats trust, authenticity, authority, expertise explicitly alongside the honest acknowledgement of power relationships and the ways in which power has to be ceded and shared. We talk about and we ask hard questions about invisible labor here and the strengths and maybe the characteristic, hang-ups and chips on the shoulders of knowledge workers. I say that as a knowledge worker myself. The next frame is a metaphor that we take from a proverb about farming, which you see on the screen. It might be too small for you to see, so I'll read it. It's a poor farmer grows weeds, a good farmer grows crops, a great farmer grows soil. And we talk here about both the need for deep, sustainable, slow investment in infrastructure and in the development of relationships. We ask questions about productivity mindsets that are kind of endemic in digital archives work that may be rooted in white supremacy. We ask what equity and sustainability looks like, what burnout looks like, and how you honor the past. The next one is seeing ourselves, and that one emphasizes how important it was for us to have an outside advisory board balanced between, in our case, experts from the worlds of Black poetry and digital libraries, along with consultants who were expert in reparative archives and in community-based archives. And we talk about how external people like that can help you ask the questions that you really just couldn't ask yourselves, and how you can subsequently then help your organizations and larger institutions maybe to face some hard truths that those questions help you unearth. The last frame is vision and connection. And that addresses something that we heard again and again about our collaboration, which is that it felt simply magical, like we had the right people in the right place at the right time to make this kind of significant change. And we definitely acknowledge some of that feels true, but then we ask some questions to potentially help others spark that connection and fellow feeling, and to help spread it outward through their organizations. So it's not felt as exclusionary or as something that is impossible to operationalize. And those are two concerns that we had about our partnership. So so really across all these frames, and finally to get back to the notion of your Sawyer seminar theme, we were asking whether the data that divide us is really a social and organizational inevitability, or whether there might be some intensely practical yet theoretically grounded ways for two like-minded and still very different organizations to collaboratively tend the data that might mend us, to think differently about evolving our institutional partnerships, and to use the work of infrastructure building, of shared equity, of reparative archival description, work that opens itself up to co-stewardship and to the intellectual authority of the very community from which a precious archive stems. You know, in our case, the intellectual authority of the international community of Black poets and of poetry lovers that coalesces around Furious Flower, to use all that, and frankly, to use the love that we've cultivated between our two organizations at all levels, and which we tap into from the broader Furious Flower community, to use all that to chart a new and a better path. And we are still on it, of course, that path. We're still walking it together, and we will be for some time. But particularly because of the strengths you all have at Stanford between the Lit Lab and CESTA and the library and other parts of your institution in data analysis, I thought I would just end by saying that I think there's a role for someone among you in considering not just the content of the archives themselves, but that love and relationality that powers a reparative archive and public access project, to consider not just the content, but what's behind it as data about building and description and use that feels maybe ineffable, but perhaps is quantifiable in some ways and can be used to demonstrate the ongoing relevance and impact and power of the humanities. And so, you know, even if you're not interested in actually undertaking something like Flowerings as a reparative archival project and an organizational partnership in future, perhaps watching patterns of community contribution, ongoing development, organizational development, and the use of an archive built on, I'll be sappy, I'll say built on love, and that over time will increasingly open itself up to further annotation and meaning making by the poetry loving public. Maybe that can lead to a meaningful project for one of you. At any rate, I thank you for listening, and that's all for me tonight. So I'll take screen sharing and mute myself.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good. I'll try to project all the way through. Certainly, I want to also begin by thanking CESTA and Giovanna for extending the invitation via email. I think it was in June, and we've been so excited and looking forward to being here. I also want to thank Cynthia McLeod, who as soon as the invitation was extended, I enlisted, didn't have to beg, just simply describe what we would be presenting, working on together, and she got on board. And so certainly very appreciative of her work. So somewhere in the description, I saw the language also perhaps coming to this work from a personal perspective. And so I'd like to start there, starting with the personal. In What's in a Name, Constructing the Walker-Williams Family of Mississippi and Virginia, I refer by name to a paternal granduncle, Walker Williams, born in DeSoto County, Mississippi, around 1894, migrating to Detroit in the early years of the Second World War. I knew Uncle Walker from 1965 until his death in 1976, during which time I got to know him as well as a child could. I wondered during those childhood years why Uncle Walker had what seemed to me to be two last names. I also was aware of at least one other person in our family whose given name seemed to be a last name. For instance, my maternal great-grandfather, Carter Braxton. 20 or more years later, I would marry another Carter, Carter McLeod Jr. In a very real sense, early interest in family member names made me something of a budding ethnographer and linguist, although I was a native and participant observer of my Mississippi to Detroit migrant family. So positioned, I observed examples both of their enduring history in the US South and their thwarted attempts at cultural and historical reinvention in Detroit. What the two warring aspects of our family's semi-modern existence reveals to me today is a temporal layering that characterizes both modernity and post-modernity. A deep interest in names has trained my eye to extract them temporarily from their context, and upon returning them to ask what other contexts, history, and locations they may belong to. This interest has brought me to the work of visiting physical archives, transcribing names, and digitizing them for the public. Philosopher Jacques Derrida, from whom we borrow the concept of textual or discursive trace for this project, conceiving of surnames as containing references to the past, also provides us in Archive Fever a way into theorizing archives, both their emergence as a fixture of economies and their shelving. Derrida's thinking on the topic assists our work as digital archons today. An archive commences, Derrida writes, and shelters, quote, but finally it also shelters itself from this memory which it shelters. In other words, an archive both shelters material and digital objects and releases itself from memory of and arguably responsibility for these acts of sheltering. Even while some archives have endured a sheltered life, they have been subjected to conversion from one media to another. For example, from original and copied handwritten documents and printed documents to captured images transformed to microfilm and microfiche, to CD-ROM, and now to the digital. Each of these new media creates a situation of potential loss of data, certainly, and also loss of memory. Perhaps the more distant we move from original objects, the more difficult it becomes to remember and also to feel, yet we can try. I echo the sentiments of historian and documentarian Thebolia Glimpf, who writes in her book chapter, Black Women and Children in the Civil War, Archival Notes, it was the document. She's referring here to a newspaper article that includes the experience of a Black father who has suffered the loss of his children. It was the document that finally stopped me in my tracks, that dramatically and profoundly shifted how I read the archives, how I see my project, and how I understand history. Glimpf is here both self-reflexive, deconstructive, that is deconstructing her own practice, and potentially revisionary. She continues, I am a historian and I am trained to be objective, scientific even, but nonetheless, my heart breaks. In Glimp's new practice, she empathizes with, and connects to the humanity of her subjects, seeing them, I think, not as objects, but again, as subjects. We note in Glimp's reference to what she calls a prayer and the listing of record types that are a part of her practice as an emancipation and Reconstruction historian. An absence of the personal effects of Blacks themselves, records that they themselves left behind, their own pronounced traces, shelved for 160 years. In comparison, as a family historian, my own work, although I love digital historian as well, my own work relies heavily on both common sources of genealogy, various forms of the federal census, vital records, probate records, chancery court records, tax records, and on, which I'm obsessed with, and emergent records such as those of the Freedmen's Bureau, USCT pension files, soldier service records, Southern Claims Commission files, and on. There are so many sources today. I would in fact say that the plethora of records available today from which to study the African-American past, which is to say an American past, places scholars possibly at the beginning of a post-sheltering stage. In turning toward emerging archives, we believe scholars working with newly surfaced records may lock once enslaved people inside a prevailing paradigm by not studying closely enough how each individual, as well as collectives, negotiated each instance, each utterance in which they exist in the public record in wartime and Reconstruction. Now our project that we intend to present to you today. The novel project to be introduced here has created a sub-data set of transcribed cover sheets, one page, of descriptive books of regiments of the United States colored troops for individual soldiers who exhibit in their cover sheets names of colonial era Tidewater and Piedmont, Virginia families. In full disclosure, the names chosen derive from a group of specific families belonging to a clan with whom my paternal ancestors were associated or enslaved by. So we're going to go to that slide, I think, of a contraband camp record that I came across that sort of got me on this path, Last Road to Freedom website, came across the first register created in the Mississippi Valley, and I came across it, and I think it was 2009, I think it was. And so, yeah, I would just point to where that arrow is. You see 4 members of my family there, and there's more we can say about this at the end, but I only want to point to one specific thing here, and that is that the slave owner is written in right there next to their names. And one other factor, which is that they all take the Williams surname, their children, except for my second great grandmother. They take the Williams surname, but the owner's surname is Hull, H-U-L-L. Could you go to the next slide? I think I'll say something about it as well. So yeah, so that's the list of planters that we sort of are starting this study with a focus on. And then if you could go to the last one, there's something I want to say about that. So ever since I discovered William Hull as the last owner of record of my family, I've also been quite obsessed with studying those families. And so when we decided that we were going to take on this work that we're going to describe tonight, we had to decide how many families we were going to study and what the surnames would be, and they come directly from this genealogy of this specific clan. And where you see the stars are where unions of different families come together, And then what you see here at the very bottom is that William Hull, his line also can be found to work its way up to these very people that you see at the top. But because this clan intermarries so much, both husband and wife descend from many of the same people. And so that orange line really goes more directly to Mary Hull's ancestors. Having a few years ago also come across on a St. Louis public library website, a database of a group of Black soldiers who enlisted in Missouri, and also a contraband camp register that someone sent me, in fact, from Giles County, Tennessee. I extracted from both of those data sets names that matched these very Virginians I was already studying. In these two cases, I discovered Herndons, again, very much William Hull is William Herndon Hull, in fact, and Dabney and Carr. And some of these names should really jump off the page at you, because some of these figures, like Herndon, Virginia, these are the same people. Some of these people should be very recognizable. Recognizing these family names, I imagine that there would be many other soldiers carrying forward other associated names. With this in mind, I began expanding the list of names to be included in a new subset. And once the data set was complete, while we intended certainly to determine how many soldiers bearing each name showed up and locate them geographically, we also chose to work on another level, isolating each of the 1,454 soldiers that make up this specific subset from others in the data set, and also from the larger body that is the United States Colored Troops, while also having a very specific goal of discovering connective tissue in addition to shared names between them. Heuristic isolation in this case is akin to what we think of as close reading of each soldier's cover sheet. We are interested, for instance, also in both idiosyncrasies and commonalities. An example of the former is what may be referred to as each soldier's unique geography, some of them including a place of birth at the county level, and others either at the town or city level or community level even. Some extinct towns, for instance, some of them appearing with no place of birth at all. It would be interesting in studying such geographies to consider the geographic information in relation to other ways in which memory gets inscribed by these men. While we do not focus in this data set on an age variable that's down the road, we suspect that the age uttered by each soldier may be an approximation for how likely is it that the actual age of the 1,454 soldiers is just as it appears in these source documents. But for only a few soldiers is that age category or that age field left blank. Despite such doubts and preciseness, sort of ironic precision, we nevertheless want to respect the data while thinking critically about these soldiers' memory, their utterances in response to exigencies of the Union Army and its policies. I think I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to make sure that we're able to get to everything. While the soldiers' cover sheets attend the enlistment of men into the military rather than civilian corps of workers, this example of civilian registration seems to carry over into the military arena. I skipped that section, but what I need to say is that certainly I have been able to discover in the contraband camp records sort of orders, including, I think it's General Order 60 in 1862 from Sherman in the Mississippi Valley, saying basically these people are to be classified as slaves. They are to be listed, just as you see in the contraband camp record, with their owners, so that we can make sure that at the end of the war, they received due compensation, meaning the slave owners received due compensation. While most soldiers in the data set do not name a former owner, we believe their names to be masterfully inscribed in the actual names of that the soldiers exhibit. We've therefore honed in on the name field, hypothesizing that it may be within this space that each soldier negotiates in an emancipatory moment identity, calling upon the memory of kin, as well as memory of masters and mistresses. Ultimately, the soldiers inscribe identity and memory through the pen of another. Isolating each record also allows us to consider who is present within the document as a human actor, the soldier himself, for example, and also the copyist and/or registrar who signed it, and the shadow of a master or mistress in the cases of enslaved men, because not all United States colored troops were enslaved men. We have some in this data set, in fact, who were free and in Canada and several northern states in the US. This last actor can no doubt be said to have played a part in each individual soldier's utterance, particularly in response to the registrar's solicitation of a name. We approach the main research object of analysis, the cover sheet of the company descriptive book for each individual soldier, as dynamic rather than as static, active rather than passive. In this case, close reading includes a humanizing ethic lent to what may be accurately described at once as both a dehumanizing and liberating moment. 10? I'm past it. I'm going to turn you over to my research partner for the data that we've been able to compile.
I have a stopwatch going, so I know 20 minutes. I got you. Next. Oh, again. And I think one more time. Okay, there's fine. So as sort of mentioned previously, we did kind of go skip a couple of the sections that she had planned to read, but in the process of transcription and doing that close reading, a couple of different research questions emerged. We started asking ourselves, what naming patterns, if any, occur in this data set? How common are double surnames? So again, that's when those like Thornton and Buckners, those show up in a person's name. What double surnames do we see? And in what places being locations, do surnames appear? And so in this study, where we're looking at both kind of these name and name place relationships, we're using somewhat a data transformation model. We do have a part of our data where we're looking at generally summary statistics, including like frequencies and things like that. And then we consider the close reading because it is such an iterative part of our process to be our qualitative data analysis. And then we take the things that emerge out of that qualitative data, which especially are kind of our interests in both name and place and where those things show up. We take those and we make them into quantitative data via two different types of mapping. I'm skipping a lot of things, but keep. And so I just wanted to quickly show some different surname variations, because during this process, what we did do was we grouped different surnames together. And so that appeared across these records. And so Fontaine, for example, had a lot of alternative spellings, including fountain, Fontaine without an E, etc. And so sometimes this wouldn't necessarily be present in the cover sheet, but we would realize that these were alternative spellings because they appear somewhere else in that file. And then this is just an example of the different people that we included in the data set. So again, as she mentioned, there was that, I think it's a selection of about 16 names that we decided to focus on because of their location and because we knew that they were related to these populations. And so with that, if that name showed up in either their first name, last name, or in that first name and last name together, that's how they got included in our data set. And that is how we got to that number of, I think it's 1454 soldiers. I Okay, so again, coming back to that question of what naming patterns, if any, occur in this data set, this was kind of just us trying to get a broad view of, what does this data look like? What are we necessarily seeing? And so what we saw were 210 unique last names. Most frequently, we saw Walker, almost overwhelmingly. We saw a total of 402 unique first names, the most frequently occurring being William, but you'll notice as well that Walker somehow appears there as well as a first name. And then the most common double surnames that we were seeing were Walker Buckner, Thornton Buckner, a lot of combinations with Buckner, which is going to come up pretty soon. And so another thing that we wanted to see is where are these surnames showing up? And so first we wanted to see, we saw that 26 states in total is where we were seeing these people both being born, well, I'm sorry, that's where we saw their states of birth, the highest being Kentucky. And if you recall, one thing that we thought was that the highest would be Virginia. These are Virginia names of Virginia planters, but actually Kentucky, we believe largely because of the Walkers, shows up as the highest, as having the highest amount of people born there. And then with states of enlistment, again, Kentucky shows up, but there are more states of enlistment at this point. You can go again. Just back one. So we, at this point, had done, this process of close reading. We've decided to focus in on name and place. And it's actually at this point that Robert Shepard, the GIS librarian at the Center for Digital Scholarship, started interacting with Professor McLeod. And what he offered to do was to take, a bit of a smaller subset of our data and start trying to create like an application that would then be searchable, both by, I believe it's name, enlistment place, and birth, place of birth. And so this is just kind of showing you some of what currently exists. Again, this is very early, and I do want to emphasize that we, at this moment, have selected a very small subset of a very large data set, which is about 179,000 US colored troops, and this is only 1,400 or so, meaning we're at about 1% of how much there actually is to look at in this data set. But what I want to bring you to, because I already see I'm over my favorite part of this presentation. So what he did on this, in this mapping, was in this yellow, you're seeing places of birth of these people, of individuals, and you're seeing the places of enlistment of them in blue. I can go to the next. And so what he does here, and kind of what I think is one of the more interesting things to think about in this data, is he draws all of these lines between both where they originate, well, not originate, where they were born, and then where they ended up enlisting. And it's after we see this that we begin, you can go to the next slide, sorry, that we begin thinking geographically, and specifically in the realm and tied to quantitative geography, and this idea that there are stories that can emerge out of data and stories that can emerge out of visualizations. And alongside quantitative geography, we wanted to think specifically about Kenneth Burke's deterministic screens and how in treating this data like a text, we can start to think about the narratives that emerge as a result of the data that we choose to focus on. And so if we go back to that previous slide, one thing that we were seeing, what we found interesting was that in this slide, the sense that I get, I don't know if it's the sense that all of you get, but, and so I suppose that is my deterministic screen, but is that you're seeing a lot of a sense of movement here. And on top of that, one thing that I noticed is how a lot of these lines stretch pretty far. And to me, and well, and to us, what we think there is that in many ways, this map can remind you of the sort of pre-existing narrative that a lot of enslaved peoples were really torn asunder. They had very little agency. They aren't around people that they know and things of that nature, which is a common narrative and not a narrative we necessarily deny. But with that, what we then thought and what we wondered about was, if this is the statement that this visualization is making, then what is potentially the counterstatement to that? And especially what is the counterstatement when we start thinking about these people whose names have appeared in conjunction with one another. And so then I think it's the next slide, one more. Okay, not big enough, but I can sort of describe what's happening here. And so what we did at this point, we took these top 16 surnames that appeared in our data set, and we placed them on here. This is their places of birth. And what you're seeing is clusters of people with these last names appearing in the same place. But more specifically, what I want to draw your attention to is, for example, and I believe it's Indiana. In Indiana, you're seeing the Walker show up together, you're seeing the Buckner show up together, and you are seeing the Herndon show up together. And clusters like that actually happen quite often. And if you go to the next slide, you can, okay, maybe you can't totally see because it's small, but you can see them actually show up together here again. That group shows up together here a bit again. They show up in all of these places together. And again, there are multiple clusters like that throughout this data set. And so the question then became, what statement is that then making? That you have, while you have these individuals who are moving very far, quite often they're moving with people that they potentially have already been in community with, as you have these names clustered together. So we're at 26. You can take it away.
All right. Well, perhaps you share with us some sense of what the implications might be for this work going forward. Sort of always inspired by and sort of driven by a goal of returning or recovering not just names, but family history to people who've suffered these sorts of losses. We think this alone, we don't know if we're ready to say that the evidence is totally conclusive, but we want to continue to expand the data set so that at some point, African Americans can both have a sense of where their ancestors were, but also that they were not there alone, that their entire time, they were connected to other people who shared common name and history. Thank you.